People said, "When you open the door for the devil came." It was true because she also opened that door for a devil. She was the one who brought that devil into her home. She saw her reflection in the broken mirror on the ground and laughed at her own reflection. A monster like herself laughed at herself. Her skin was pale, too pallid, with bloodied scars on her forehead. Her face lost all its color. It now looked deathly thin. Her lips cracked, and blood dripped from the corners of her lips. Her hair looks greasy. She looks sickly. She turned around and looked out through the balcony of the 3rd floor to see the night sky. And what did she see there? The brightest star of all. A shining star so close that when she closed her eyes, she could almost touch it. But when she opened her eyes again, it was already gone. It had moved further away than ever before, and there was no way she would find it again. At the sound of the alarm, she got up in a panic. Drops of sweat glistened on her forehead. With trembling hands, she quickly wiped them off. She had not slept well for the past few months. Her mind raced with thoughts and fears about how she could kill someone. She quickly stumbled toward the bathroom, her eyes still half closed. She limped as she dragged herself into the bathroom. She glanced at her reflection, and her black orb stared back at her. She noticed that her face was injured and bloodied, just like she had seen in her dreams. Her black hair was messy and the dust was visible. She quickly stepped into the shower, bracing herself for the cold water. Despite the initial shock, she felt invigorated and more alert. With every passing second, she became more aware of her surroundings. The pain subsided to a dull throbbing. She began feeling nauseous, as though her body was being torn apart. Images of lifeless bodies flashed before her eyes, and she instantly shook them off. She focused on washing her hair and scrubbing her body vigorously, trying to forget her nightmare. Her heart rate gradually slowed. As her shower continued, the image began playing in her head. The screams, cries, and chaos around her seemed to get farther and farther away until all she could see were her hands. A small scream escaped her lips as her skin began to change color, becoming paler, darker, and more grotesque. Blood began dripping everywhere. The scene changed to a familiar room. The bed was empty. A large mirror hung opposite the wall. Its surface reflected the dark night sky as the moonlight illuminated a portion of the room. In a far corner lay a figure covered in blood. An overpowering smell invaded her nostrils. Her vision blurred as darkness swallowed her. Her heartbeat accelerated, and her breathing became labored. She gripped her chest as she struggled to catch her breath. Sweat trickled down her temples as she leaned forward, clutching tightly onto the shower head as overwhelming fear crept up on her. She tried so hard to control her breathing, but it was impossible. She couldn't stop her breathing from growing irregularly. Every inhale felt more painful than the last. She squeezed her eyes shut in vain attempts to escape. The bathroom began spinning as she clutched harder onto the shower curtain, desperately wishing to hold onto something. Eventually, even with the strength of her hands, she began sliding toward the edge of the bathtub, until finally she toppled over the rim and plunged into icy cold water. After lying there for a few seconds, she quickly got up, coughing uncontrollably as the freezing spray stung her exposed face. She struggled to get her head above water as the cold water washed away her memories. She washed the blood from her face and cleaned her scars properly. She slipped into a formal swan-white shirt and beige pants. Before leaving the room, she concealed her scars so no one would ask about them. Honestly, she didn't know either. She headed downstairs, where the clattering of dishes and the enticing aroma of food filled the air. "Good morning, Mum," she greeted as she entered the kitchen. Her mother, Ms. Elizabeth, turned toward her and planted a kiss on her cheek. "Happy birthday, Blair," she said. Blair glanced at her, realizing that she had completely forgotten that today marked her 26th birthday. "Thank you, Mom," she expressed as she swiftly grabbed her beloved Americano coffee and began savoring its flavors. It was a day when she had to arrive at the office early, yet she found herself running behind schedule. Placing the now empty coffee mug on the table, she turned her gaze toward her mother, who was busy with something in the fridge. Ms. Elizabeth seemed to be on a quest for something specific. Eventually, she discovered what she had been seeking, a cupcake adorned with a delicate pink candle. Blair eagerly watched her mom, her eyes filled with excitement. With a smile on her face, she observed as Ms. Elizabeth placed the cupcake onto a small plate. Despite her forgetfulness in the morning rush, Ms. Elizabeth had not forgotten. She had a unique talent for turning even the most ordinary actions into something special. "Mom, I'm running late today. Our company's president, Ms. Charlotte, is coming, and I cannot afford to be tardy." "Ms. Charlotte? Why is she coming?" Blair glanced at her mom in astonishment, as she had told her last night that today was a very important day at the office. "Because today Mr. Ethan is taking charge of our Lopez Food Company as the new CEO," she replied. "Well, being 5 minutes late won't make a difference," Ms. Elizabeth said as she lit the candle on the cupcake. "I just wanted to ensure that you began your day with a small celebration." "Mom, thank you," she managed to say before quickly extinguishing the candle, slicing the cake, and offering a bite to her mother. She then hurried outside, devouring the remaining piece. The delectable sweetness of the frosting and the tender texture of the cake filled her mouth, evoking nostalgic memories of past birthdays and the happiness that always accompanied her mother's presence. As she joined the bustling crowd on the streets, the morning rush was in full swing. The air filled with the sound of cars honking and people chatting, creating a lively atmosphere. Upon entering the office, she noticed a significant change in the air. Everyone seemed to be in a frenzy, rushing around. In her haste, she accidentally bumped into someone. However, she quickly sat down and began organizing her bag, gathering all the scattered pages until they were neatly arranged and ready to be picked up. Suddenly, her phone started vibrating, prompting her to retrieve it from her pocket. It turned out to be yet another text message from Masson. "Why did you arrive so late, Blair?" Evelyn's voice interrupted her thoughts, causing her to put her phone away. "Yeah, I was late today. My eyes just refused to open early this morning," Blair replied, slightly amused. "Well, now the boss will make sure your eyes are wide open," Evelyn warned her in a serious tone. Evelyn had been her good friend since they met 4 years ago. She was in her late 20s, with bright brown eyes and dark hair styled in soft curls around her face. Her smile was perfect. When they met on that first day, they clicked instantly. They shared much more than just a great sense of humor. Their personalities meshed seamlessly. Blair often talked about her latest cake creations while Evelyn listened with a soft expression. They had similar tastes in music and movies, though Blair preferred indie over pop or hip-hop. They were equally passionate about books, which led Evelyn to share stories about her family's love for reading, even though she hadn't read much herself. "Why? What's going on? Where is the boss?" Blair inquired, feeling a sense of concern. "In her office," Evelyn replied, gesturing with her eyes. Blair glanced toward the glass door and saw her boss in a heated argument with William. She wore a form-fitting black pencil skirt, complemented by black silk stockings and matching high heels, along with an opulent crimson blouse adorned with sparkling diamond embellishments. As their eyes met through the reflective surface of the door, Blair noticed irritation etched on her face. Blair felt a pang of anxiety as she watched the scene unfold. It was unusual for the boss to reprimand William, a highly respected employee, so early in the day. Hastily arranging her belongings on her desk, Blair cautiously approached the office, hoping to avoid any scolding this morning. Upon entering the office, she felt the air thick with tension. William appeared visibly flustered and filled with remorse. Sitting behind her desk, Ms. Dorothy, the boss, wore a disappointed and frustrated expression. "William, how could you be so careless? Your mistake has cost us a major client in Singapore, resulting in billions of dollars in losses," Ms. Dorothy yelled at him. A knot formed in Blair's stomach as she considered the situation. William was known for his meticulousness and attention to detail. It was highly unusual for him to make such a significant mistake. Blair couldn't help but wonder what had gone wrong. "I understand, but I don't want to hear any excuses, William. This was a crucial account, and you were responsible for ensuring its success. Now we've lost not only a valuable client but also a significant amount of revenue. Ms. Dorothy's voice boomed, making Blair involuntarily flinch. Ms. Dorothy gestured for William to leave and then turned her attention towards Blair, her tone filled with frustration. Why on earth are you just standing there like a complete idiot? Blair felt a pang of envy as she watched Kaylee and Ms. Dorothy interact so seamlessly. It was hard not to compare herself to Kaylee, who seemed to effortlessly command the boss's approval. Blair shook her head, trying to push away the negative thoughts as she approached. "Hey, Kaylee," she said, forcing a smile. "How's everything going?" Kaylee turned, her expression brightening. "Almost ready. Just a few last-minute adjustments, and we'll be set for Miss Charlotte's arrival." Blair nodded, hoping her own nerves didn't show. "Do you need any help? I can assist with the decorations or refreshments." "That would be great," Kaylee replied, glancing back at Ms. Dorothy. "She's a bit stressed, and I could use another set of hands." Blair felt a small surge of relief. Maybe this was her chance to prove herself. As they moved together to the refreshments table, she quickly took stock of what was needed. "Do you know what Miss Charlotte prefers?" Blair asked, trying to sound casual. Kaylee shrugged, focusing on arranging the pastries. "She likes everything to be perfect. Presentation matters more than anything else. If it doesn't look right, you'll hear about it." Blair's stomach twisted at the thought. With her own pressures looming, the idea of failing in front of the new CEO was daunting. She took a deep breath, reminding herself that she could handle it. As they worked, the tension in the air became palpable. Employees rushed about, and the faint sound of cameras clicking hinted that the press was gathering outside. Blair caught a glimpse of Evelyn, who was already engaging with the reporters, her bright smile cutting through the chaos. "Let's make sure everything is set before they start streaming in," Kaylee said, snapping Blair back to reality. "Right, let's finish up," Blair agreed, focusing on her tasks. She wanted to make today memorable not just for Miss Charlotte, but for herself too. This was her chance to shine amidst the pressure. They finished arranging the final touches just as Ms. Dorothy emerged from her office, her demeanor still tense but slightly more composed. "Is everything ready?" she called out, scanning the room with an authoritative gaze. "Almost done, boss," Kaylee replied, straightening up. Blair felt her heart race as Ms. Dorothy approached them. "Make sure it's flawless," she said, her voice low but firm. "We can't afford any mistakes today." Blair nodded, determination flooding her. She would not let Ms. Dorothy down herself. As the final minutes ticked away, she could feel the weight of expectations resting heavily on her shoulders. But deep down she knew she was capable. Today had to be perfect. "I hoped you disappeared, Kaylee," Blair muttered, unsure if it was fueled by her envy or pure rage. She had always yearned to be the one standing by the boss's side, aiding and backing her up. At precisely 10 o'clock, Ethan Lopez entered the hallway, causing all the cameras to shift their focus onto him. He was the only child of the company's president, Miss Charlotte Lopez, and the exclusive proprietor of Lopez Food Company, having recently finished his education in Australia. Amidst the bustling crowd, the sound of his footsteps went unnoticed. He possessed a captivating allure, with his slender frame, lustrous light brown hair, and piercing blue eyes, which he hid behind glasses. He held an air of enigma and charm. Clad in a black suit and gray tie, he exuded an aura of effortless elegance, accentuating his tan and emanating a distinct sense of cool sophistication. As he strolled down the aisle of the hall, where individuals sat in rows of red velvet chairs, he greeted each person with a charming smile. Blair couldn't help but think how perfect his life was. Just then, Mason's message appeared on her phone screen, snapping her back to reality. She tapped the screen to read his message. "Opulent Heights, Luxor Lodgings Hotel. Meeting, 10:30 p.m. Flashback. How long did you sit here in your dead mother's room, Charlotte? It had been a month since she died." She lifted her head upon hearing her father's voice, her eyes heavy with sorrow and weariness. The room remained untouched, adorned with her mother's possessions, as if it was trapped in a moment frozen in time. Once more, Charlotte turned her gaze towards her mother's photograph. Her mother's smile greeted her from the frame on her dresser. Her eyes wide open and filled with joy, devoid of any trace of pain or sadness. As her lengthy blonde hair was neatly tied up in a bun, it exposed the pallid complexion of her face, which had faded with the passing years. However, even in that moment, her beauty remained captivating. Charlotte felt tears forming within her, and she had to restrain them from streaming down her face. A soft sigh escaped her lips, the only sound in the silent house. Now that you are 8 months pregnant, you should not take too much stress in such a condition, her father advised her while sitting on a chair. Charlotte gently rubbed her swollen belly and sighed as she leaned back, feeling the weight of her growing baby inside her. "I know, Dad," she replied, trying to sound calm despite the anxiety that had built up inside her. "But I won't leave you alone, and Gabriel knew anyway, so he didn't mind me staying here." "And why would he have a problem with this?" Charlotte shrugged. Though she was a wife of Gabriel Hernandez, the owner of the Hernandez empire, she was also the sole heir of Lopez Food Company. While her businesses were smaller in scale, her influence over the food chain was far from negligible. Charlotte made sure to keep her father aware of this fact whenever possible, and he never failed to let her know how happy he was for his daughter. In fact, he often sent her expensive gifts when she was away from home. Even though he didn't mind, still these twins needed their father, and it was good for them to see their parents first as soon as they were born. Her father tried to convince her. After listening to him, Charlotte gently caressed her belly, feeling the tiny kicks of life within. She couldn't help but feel a surge of pride and responsibility. These unborn twins were not just any ordinary members of their family. They were destined to become the future heirs of the Hernandez Empire and Lopez Food Company. Charlotte imagined the day when their soon-to-be-born twins would take their first steps, their tiny feet leaving imprints on the same ground that their father had once walked. They would grow up under Gabriel's watchful eye, learning the ways of their family and understanding the importance of unity, loyalty, and respect. Keeping both things in mind, Charlotte decided to go back to the Hernandez mansion. The rain poured down heavily outside. It dawned on her that exactly 1 year ago that day, she had tied the knot with Gabriel amidst a similar downpour. "Stop, don't go alone in such weather. The driver will drop you," her father said, showing his concern. She replied, "I'll be fine, don't worry," as she sat in the car. She felt a wave of eagerness and nostalgia as the automobile began to move. Raindrops flowed down the window, making it difficult to see the familiar buildings and streets. Her mind filled with memories of that soggy wedding day, which made her grin. How content they were at that time together, and how she longed to simply return to those times, feeling she would never regain. She pulled her coat tight over her torso as she got out of the car, the rain pelting down. With a sense of grandeur and majesty, the Hernandez palace towered above her. She could hear the distant sounds of the bustling metropolis, which created a haunting yet alluring atmosphere. As she stepped through the mansion's doors, the smell of pine and damp soil filled the air, making her feel at ease and nostalgic. In the corridor, she ran into Liam Cadell, Gabriel's personal driver, and asked him where her husband was. Since it was an odd hour, Liam seemed taken aback to see her there at that particular time. "Ma'am, if you wanted to return, you should have informed me beforehand, and I would have personally fetched you." But because of the erratic fluctuations in her pregnancy mood, it was difficult for her to stay in the moment and talk to him. Therefore, ignoring what he had said, she asked, "Where can I look for him?" "Gabriel has gone to the city for a meeting," informed their housekeeper Ella, who had most likely stopped by to listen. "Why is he having a meeting at this time?" Charlotte exclaimed, taken aback. It was unusual for him to go to the city for meetings, especially in the evening. Trying to conceal her anxiety, she asked, "Do you know when he'll be back?" She was really surprised. Ella paused for a moment before responding, "I'm not certain. He didn't mention the time of his meeting. Usually, when something like this happens, he doesn't return home at night." "What do you mean by he doesn't return home? And what are those meetings that go on late into the night?" Charlotte inquired, raising her voice a bit to get Liam's attention. He averted his gaze in response. Charlotte had already grasped the meaning behind his gesture. "How long had this been going on?" she asked. "For about a month now, ma'am," Ella responded. Curiosity and anxiety consumed her as she persisted. What was the purpose of these meetings? Charlotte's voice quivered slightly. She craved immediate answers, and she couldn't wait any longer. Liam let out a deep sigh, his posture drooping. "Ma'am, we cannot disclose this information to you. It is for your own protection." Charlotte felt disappointed after hearing what he had to say. Security. What could happen to my protection? She had always regarded herself as a valued part of this family, leading a typical life. But it seemed there was another world, one she was unaware of. Ella approached, her expression filled with worry. "Ma'am, we never intended to withhold this information from you, but the situation forced our hand. It was in your best interest to stay unaware." Charlotte vehemently disagreed, feeling a surge of frustration. "Shut up, you are nobody to tell me what is right and what is wrong. I have the right to know what's happening. I have the right to be involved in whatever is unfolding." Charlotte went back by herself, without consulting anyone or following their advice. Although she was unaware of his meetings, she knew the place they frequently visited, which was his flat. She briefly forgot that she had two lives inside her as she raced through the downpour. After an hour's trip, she felt overcome with anxiety as she stood in front of a stunning apartment. She exhaled deeply, trying to clear her mind before going into the flat. Knowing its digital lock, she punched in the code with ease, and the door opened. She closed the door behind her and paused to look around. The living room was dark, and the silence was deafening, making her thoughts race through her head. She looked at the open door to her bedroom, where she and Gabriel had once slept. She heard faint whispers coming from inside. A dim source of light appeared as a soft glow filtered through the half-open door. She moved stealthily toward the room, taking care to avoid making a sound. Disbelief overcame her as she looked through the small opening and saw what was happening. She saw her husband with another woman. They laughed at something while drinking and enjoying their so-called meetings. Charlotte felt disgusted, as if it were somehow her fault that they were together. Rage consumed every part of her body. Her hands trembled violently, and she felt hot tears fill her eyes. The room that once held cherished memories of love now felt like a betrayal. Anger surged through her veins, but she couldn't tear her eyes away from the painful sight. The woman's laughter echoed in the room, mocking the love they once shared. How could Gabriel do this to me? Gabriel, the person I trusted and loved, gave me this heart-wrenching pain. Questions swirled in her mind, each one more painful than the last. They were planning something, and Charlotte wanted to hear, so she leaned further and listened to her nightmare. Now I really got tired of her and felt trapped in this marriage, but I didn't know the way out, Gabriel said as he held her hand. Then just get rid of her, that woman replied as she took a sip from her glass. Get rid? Just like you planned to get rid of her parents, she shrugged. Not to mention you already killed her mother. But I can't kill her now. I mean, she is pregnant with my twins. Gabriel looked quite concerned. As if you wanted them under... Yeah, but I wanted Lopez Food Company shares. If I killed her now, we might lose those shares. So we have to wait till next year. Gabriel poured another glass of wine for himself. Next year, that woman exclaimed. Her eyes pierced into his soul. You wanted me to wait that long? No, baby, I don't want you to wait. Gabriel stood up from his seat and walked towards her. But who will raise them? He pulled her in his embrace and took a quick peck on her lips. I don't want to burden you. I can raise those kids, but close this chapter as soon as possible, that woman growled. Charlotte mustered all her remaining courage and pushed the door open, making it squeak loudly. The faint light made it hard to see the woman's face. Or perhaps Charlotte was just trying to draw their attention to herself. When Gabriel and the woman suddenly turned to face her, their expressions a mixture of surprise and shock, a thick stillness fell over the room. The woman was none other than her best friend, Sarah. Felt like her world was spinning. Everything blurred before her eyes as she tried to process what had happened. She didn't know when it all started between them, but witnessing them together in that moment suggested they had been acquainted for quite some time. Sarah and Charlotte had been friends since childhood. They shared everything from their deepest secrets to their wildest dreams, but she never imagined sharing her husband. She never imagined that her best friend would be the one to stab her in the back. Tears welled up in her eyes, blurring her vision as Charlotte struggled to find her voice. "How could you?" she managed to choke out, her voice trembling with a mix of hurt and anger. Charlotte had often heard her husband speak of Sarah, praising her intelligence and beauty at various gatherings. She had always brushed it off as mere admiration for a dear friend, never suspecting that something deeper was going on. The impact of realization struck her like a thunderbolt, sending shockwaves of emotion through her body. How oblivious she had been. The signs had been right in front of her, like a door to her ignorance. The covert late-night conversations, the furtive gazes they shared when they thought nobody was observing it, all became crystal clear in that moment, and Charlotte was astounded by her previous lack of perception. Her sight grew hazy, and she heard nothing except static as a wave of dizziness swept through her mind. Her knees gave out. She felt someone hold her arms before the ground rushed up to meet her face. Later, she regained consciousness in the hospital, only to see a distressing sight beside her bed. Her only son. Charlotte sat up abruptly and immediately searched for her other son, but he was nowhere to be found. Panic took hold as she desperately scoured every corner of the hospital room. He wasn't there. What else might he be? What if someone had taken him? Charlotte thought feverishly. As she stood up, she felt her heart pounding frantically against her chest and her legs growing numb. How much had he wept before being taken away? Didn't someone have the ability to assist him? Was he now all right? Now, what should we do to this, Charlotte? She suddenly overheard Sarah speaking to Gabriel in a hushed tone from behind the closed door. Gabriel let out a deep sigh, his voice filled with animosity. What should we do? Just increase her medication dosage. Charlotte strained to listen to their discussion. And what about that second child? Sarah asked, unknowingly causing Charlotte to instinctively reach out toward her son's bed. Gabriel's words pierced her ears. How much harm could a deceased child cause? A shiver ran down Charlotte's spine as his revelation settled in. The atmosphere in the hospital room became stifling, making it difficult for her to breathe. The weight of his disclosure bore down on her chest, almost suffocating her. However, the thunderous applause forced her to bury her painful memories in the depths of the past. She saw Ethan standing on stage, addressing the press. The president of this company, Miss Charlotte Lopez. He gazed at his mother with a smile. She is not only my mother but also a remarkable woman who single-handedly established Lopez Food Company with my grandfather. Throughout her life, she has been a source of strength and independence, and she holds great admiration for me. Now, the time has come for me to assume the responsibility of being the successor of our family business. Charlotte was a middle-aged woman who still looked young despite her age. Her blonde hair was tied in a neat bun at the back of her head. She had blue eyes that resembled the sky, just like her son's. The color of her skin contrasted with the paleness of her features, clear like an apple. She wore an elegant dress made of the finest material and embellished with gold thread. Several rings sparkled on each of her fingers in the light of her room. A single golden chain lay around her neck, resembling the sun, shining above her shoulder as it glowed and reflected the white ceiling of the room. She looked at the camera with a smile on her face, her blue eyes twinkling. As soon as the speech ended, Miss Charlotte boldly picked up her bag and headed for her son's office, following the bright flashes from the cameras. He started his work there that day. She felt the importance of that moment as she made her way through the bustling crowd of reporters and photographers. Upon entering the office, Miss Charlotte quickly dropped the phony grin and looked at Kaylee gravely. She understood Miss Charlotte's quiet message instantly and gave a subtle nod of recognition. She shifted the multimedia images with a quick flick of her fingers. Sir, our net profit from 2005 to 2022 was $247 million. However, as of the start of this year, our shares experienced a 15% decrease compared to the previous year. Kaylee reported. Ethan paid close attention, his face displaying concern. What could have caused this huge decline, he inquired. In response, Kaylee said, our industry was impacted by several issues. First, our market share was affected by increased competition. Second, our profitability was also impacted by adverse economic conditions, such as growing inflation and higher production costs. Last but not least, there were issues with our business's capacity to adjust to shifting customer tastes and technological developments. Ethan sighed, realizing the gravity of the situation. We needed to take immediate action to reverse this trend. What strategies did you suggest we implement? It was quite challenging to take action at that time, Kaylee responded. Why was it so tough? Kaylee glanced at Ms. Charlotte in response to Ethan's question. Because, Ms. Charlotte replied, initiating the discussion. We received anonymous messages from an unknown sender who seemed to be targeting the companies associated with us. This individual actively took steps to conceal their identity. Anonymous messages. Ethan frowned. Some expired food products were sold under our company's label. As a result, people who consumed them experienced food poisoning. This information was reported to the food inspection authorities, who then sent the food items to the lab for testing. Yesterday, we received the test results. Why didn't you inform me about everything that happened? It appeared to be a significant instance of defamation and harassment, Ethan interjected, interrupting Miss Charlotte. Since you were in Australia, I didn't want you to get affected. Ethan inquired. Did the reports arrive from the lab? Yes, and they found a large amount of salmonella in our food products, Ms. Charlotte responded. Did you conduct a thorough investigation, Ms. President? I had already informed the authorities, Ms. Charlotte said thoughtfully. But you know these types of investigations took time, so we couldn't do anything but wait. She took a deep breath. Sir, I prepared a statement that we could issue once we had a better grasp of the situation, Kaylee responded. Ethan nodded, clearly upset by the situation. He never expected such a welcome in the business world. Miss Charlotte, tonight you had a scheduled meeting with a delegate from Singapore at the Grand Oasis Hotel. Kaylee informed her about her next schedule. From now on, the new CEO of Lopez Food Company will handle all business matters, Miss Charlotte stated, directing her attention toward her son. Reschedule the meeting at the Luxor Lodgings Hotel instead of the Grand Oasis, Ethan instructed. And what time, sir? Kaylee inquired. 10:30 p.m., Ethan said before leaving the meeting room with Miss Charlotte. At precisely 11:45 p.m., a young woman tragically plummeted from the highest floor of the Luxor Lodgings Hotel. The atmosphere enveloped in stillness was interrupted only by the faint hum of passing vehicles and sporadic wails of sirens. Oblivious to the unfolding calamity above, the hotel guests remained blissfully unaware. However, as the girl's lifeless form violently collided with the unforgiving pavement below, a collective gasp reverberated throughout the premises. The sheer force of the impact shattered the tranquility of the night, compelling heads to swivel and hearts to quicken their pace. Panic erupted as individuals hurried outside, desperately trying to comprehend the recent events. Whose penthouse was that? A voice echoed. It belonged to Ethan Lopez, the new CEO of Lopez Food Company. 3 hours earlier, Opulent Heights. At 9 p.m., Ethan sat in his penthouse, Opulent Heights. He wore black jeans, sneakers, and a white turtleneck sweater, listening to something on his hands-free device. His hair was slightly tousled from the breeze coming in through the open window, and he leaned on one arm with his legs crossed on the sofa. Without his blue contact lenses and eyeglasses, he looked different, sipping his Chateau Lafite 1869 wine. His gaze was fixed on the wall clock, as if waiting for someone to arrive. He seemed quiet, calm, and relaxed. Suddenly, the doorbell rang. He took out his phone and typed a few words to Kaylee before heading to open the door. Four individuals entered the room, all dressed in black suits and wearing stern, serious expressions. One of them tightly clutched a briefcase, as if it held something of great significance. The others positioned themselves in a formation, their eyes fixed on their leader. "Welcome, Mr. Thomas Martinez," Ethan chuckled, introducing one of them and warmly shaking his hand. "I hope I'm not bothering you, Mr. Ethan Lopez," Thomas smiled back. They both walked toward the sofa where Ethan had been seated. Thomas was a middle-aged man, tall and slender but still muscular. He had long sideburns framing his clean-shaven face, and his short hair seemed styled with gel. His dark skin was smooth and glossy, and he wore a silver necklace that glistened under the light. He worked for Ethan, handling all his illegal activities and underground business, and Ethan had given him considerable freedom to operate. "The meeting will be scheduled for next week," Thomas began. "We have important news to announce to you." "About what?" Ethan asked, tilting his head to the right, curious. "Was there any new information?" "There was a lot of good news," Thomas chuckled. Ethan took another sip from his glass and motioned for him to continue. "First, we discovered the whereabouts of those 4 men you asked about." Ethan's eyes widened. "They were hiding in New York," Thomas continued. "We found a warehouse near Central Park where a large number of illegal weapons were stored." Ethan stared at his hands and nodded as understanding dawned on him. "When we searched through them, they seemed mostly related to guns and other explosives." Thomas paused. "But one particular object caught our attention, Mr. Lopez." Thomas held up a small metallic object. It was a tiny round device resembling an eye. Ethan's eyebrows knit together in confusion. A prototype that hid a memory chip. Ethan took a deep breath as he held it, feeling like he had been waiting for this chip to arrive. Ethan closed his eyes and exhaled heavily. He stood up, holding the prototype firmly, and walked toward the locker. There was no hesitation in his steps or voice. He unlocked it with one swift movement, placed the device inside, and took out a brown file. He returned to where Thomas was sitting and handed the file to him. Thomas looked at the file and then at Ethan. Ethan gave a confident smile, indicating for Thomas to look inside the file. "You'll find everything you need," Ethan said proudly. Thomas slowly opened the file. Inside were pages with pictures printed on them, pictures of girls. Thomas looked at him with a satisfied smile on his face. "Total of 50 merchandise for the drop-off," Ethan smirked. The packages were ready to go. They were all prepped and waiting for the delivery. Good. We couldn't afford any slip-ups this time." "The buyers were getting impatient," Thomas nodded. "Don't worry, everything was on schedule." The merchandise dash, Ethan was about to say more when he heard a noise outside the door. His eyebrow raised, and his lips formed a thin line. His expression turned hard. He checked the clock, which showed 11 p.m. He swiftly opened the door and saw Kaylee, standing frozen in front of him. Her expression was a mix of horror, disbelief, and anger. She looked like she was ready to cry. "Kaylee?" Ethan asked in surprise and confusion. She didn't respond. All she could manage was a small sobbing sound, and it was heartbreaking. "What were you doing here?" Ethan almost yelled. She flinched at his tone. He looked away and sighed heavily, his tone cold and harsh, which made her faint. Ethan looked around, reassured that no one was watching them. He picked her up and brought her inside. 1 hour after Thomas' arrival, at 10 p.m. At precisely 10 p.m., the taxi came to a halt in front of Luxor Lodgings Hotel. Kaylee settled the fare and got out, carrying her bag and laptop. Gazing up at the majestic hotel, its glass windows mirrored the city lights, creating a dazzling spectacle in the darkness. As she stepped onto the sidewalk, walking on her heels, a refreshing breeze caressed her face, carrying the vibrant aroma of the bustling city. She arrived at the hotel for a significant business conference with Ethan, and Opulent Heights had been selected as the venue. The hotel's reputation for opulence and sophistication preceded it. It was her first visit to this magnificent hotel, and she felt a surge of excitement as she approached the entrance. The doorman welcomed her warmly, opening the magnificent double doors to reveal a luxurious lobby adorned with marble floors and glistening chandeliers. The gentle melody of a piano filled the air, creating an ambience of elegance and serenity. She proceeded to the elevator and pressed the button for the 100th floor. A slight nervousness filled her as the conference held great significance for their company, particularly for their new CEO, Mr. Ethan, in revitalizing their business. The elevator doors opened, revealing a pristine hallway decorated with luxurious carpets and elegant artwork. As she made her way toward his penthouse, she took a deep breath to ease her nerves before knocking on the door. But the sound of laughter from inside forced her to stop and listen. She couldn't believe it was the same person who had given a speech at Lopez Food Company in the morning. She moved a little closer to listen to their plans clearly, but her feet staggered and she bumped into the door. Slowly, Kaylee opened her eyes. She found herself lying on a sofa she had never seen before. It looked comfortable, warm, and very soft. The cream-colored walls were adorned with abstract art, but the bright light from a lamp blinded her, so she shut her eyes tight against it, trying not to flinch away from its brightness. After a moment, her eyes adjusted to the light, and she realized she was in the Opulent Heights penthouse, which made her stomach turn. She sat up with a gasp and looked at Ethan in disbelief. He sat next to her with a gun in his right hand and a glass of wine in his left. The smirk on his face made him look like a maniac. "Hiya, sweetheart. Didn't you check your phone before coming here?" Kaylee swallowed hard and shook her head. Taking a moment to assess the situation, she thought about her phone. With trembling hands, she started pulling it out from her bag. Her fingers felt clumsy as they fumbled with it, and she almost dropped it several times. Finally, she managed to grab the device from the table and turn it on without knocking anything over, only to see nothing. What was she supposed to check? She glanced at Ethan, who was still pointing the gun at her. What am I supposed to check?" she finally managed to ask him. Her mouth was so dry she could barely speak. Wasn't he going to tell her what to check? There was something she had to do now. Was he really going to kill her? She realized she wouldn't know where to start. She had to escape first. "You have to let me go," she said desperately, putting on her best begging voice. Ethan smiled back at her. "You think?" His dark gaze traveled down to her body, making her heart stop for a couple of seconds. "I can just shoot you right there in your heart." That was when the true horror hit her. Kaylee yelled frantically and jumped from the sofa and tried to run. She was too late. Ethan didn't hesitate a moment longer. In one fluid motion, his hands pulled the trigger of his handgun and the bullet hit the wall. Hastily, she covered her ears with her fingers to muffle the sound of the gunfire, but it seemed he had used acoustic panels. Slowly she lifted her head up and saw a large hole appeared in the wall where the bullet had struck. Kaylee ran faster, but before she could get too far, she tripped on the rug and fell onto the floor. Ethan chuckled, but then raised the gun again. This time, however, he wasn't smiling anymore. "Where were you heading anyway?" he asked her. Then he stood up and calmly walked toward her until he was right in front of her. "You can't leave this place without my permission." The gun he gripped was aimed directly at her head. "You have no choice but to surrender, or else I will shoot you in your head right here and now," he uttered in a hushed, snake-like tone. His words were delivered with a casual yet chilling coldness, leaving no room for negotiation. She never expected Mr. Ethan to be like this. His expression lacked any emotion or fear, resembling more of an assassin than the owner of any company, someone who wouldn't hesitate to take a life. A shiver ran down her spine as she cautiously stepped away and tried to run again. Ethan pulled the trigger of his handgun again, causing a shot to ring out and strike the side of the wall, leaving another hole. "Oh, come on, Ethan, don't be such a killjoy. Let me handle this one." A voice came from behind Ethan and she looked at him. That was when she realized they were not alone. There were 4 other men besides Ethan and her, including a man with a burn mark on his face who was staring at her. A sense of uneasiness arose in his eyes. There was something about him that felt familiar, but she couldn't quite place it. Suddenly, a memory flashed in her mind. Months ago, she had come across a newspaper article about a notorious criminal named Thomas Martinez. He was infamous for his ruthless nature and involvement in various illegal activities. Her heart raced as she realized the man standing before her could be the same Thomas Martinez, wanted by the police for multiple crimes. Panic washed over her as she grasped the danger she was in. How had she ended up with a wanted criminal? Was this some sort of setup? Why hadn't Ethan told her that the meeting was cancelled or postponed? At least she could have stayed safe at home. Countless questions swirled in her mind, but she knew there was nothing she could do at that moment. Was this the end for her? Kaylee quickly looked down when she saw Thomas staring at her, with a charming smile on his face. He took a sip of wine and looked at the scene before him. It felt like watching a comedy show or an episode of Scooby-Doo. "Look up," he said, and she raised her face fearfully at Ethan's voice, but her eyes remained fixed on Thomas's feet. Her mind was focused on ensuring those footsteps did not approach her. Her breath quickened. "Look at me," he commanded again, but she continued to stare at Thomas's feet. Ethan stepped forward and forcefully lifted her hair to make her face him. When she finally looked up, she saw him leaning down in front of her. His eyes had a strange gleam like a wolf's eyes ready to attack its prey. It felt as if he could tear her apart any second. "When I give an order, it must be obeyed immediately." She trembled as Ethan's grip tightened on her hair, compelling her to meet his gaze. She stared into his cold and angry black eyes. Thomas, who had been enjoying the scene, finally spoke up. "Ethan, please don't hurt her." Ethan's grip loosened slightly, but his gaze remained fixed on her. "She needs to understand her place, Thomas. I cannot tolerate her disobedience. She is worth millions of dollars, so please don't harm her," Thomas said. Kaylee shifted her gaze from Ethan to Thomas, trying to comprehend his words. Any damage to her face would decrease her value. "She is precious," he smirked. Kaylee felt uneasy under Thomas's intense stare, a knot forming in her stomach. His words lingered in the air, causing her to question the situation. She released Ethan's grip on her hair, holding back her anger for a moment. His eyes flickered with a mix of curiosity and greed as he turned his attention to Thomas. "How much is she worth?" Ethan asked, his voice filled with intrigue. Thomas sat back on the sofa, his eyes darting between Ethan and Kaylee. "She is a rare, highly prized possession in the underground market. Her beauty, intelligence, and innocence all contribute to her significant price tag." Her heart raced as she listened to their conversation, realizing the seriousness of her predicament. She had always known she was beautiful, but she never imagined her value would one day be measured in dollars. Ethan walked toward Thomas, a sinister smile playing on his lips. "So, you're saying I could sell her and make a fortune?" "Yes, you can add her to those 50 girls," Thomas said, looking into Ethan's eyes. A wave of despair washed over her as she realized the depths of the darkness surrounding her. She had always dreamed of a life filled with love and freedom, but now those dreams seemed like distant fantasies. "But I will never let them decide my fate," Kaylee promised herself. She quickly got up and ran toward the door to save her life. Her heart hammered in her chest as fear coursed through her veins. "Catch her," Ethan ordered Thomas, and one of the guards grabbed her and forcefully slammed her into the wall. Her head hit a picture hanging on the wall, causing it to fall and shatter. Just as she hoped, Ethan delivered a strong slap to her cheek. "Don't try to run," he said, his voice deep and dark, sending shivers down her spine. He turned to face Thomas. "Take her out of here. We'll deal with the rest later." As Thomas reached forward to grab her again, she instinctively jerked back, pushed the guard, and managed to escape through the door. In her haste, she bumped into someone and nearly fell, but quickly recovered and started running again. The fear of being kidnapped by Ethan again propelled her to move even faster. She felt like she had no control over herself. Her body was moving on its own, not thinking straight, just doing what seemed like the best option for survival. Her mind was going haywire from all the stress and fear. All she wanted was a moment to breathe so that maybe, just maybe she would be able to stop crying, but her tears just wouldn't leave her eyes. Her body was so cold and sweaty, she could hardly walk without dropping something. She looked around for anything that could help her, but the only thing she saw was the stairs, which seemed impossibly far away. Instead of trying to escape down the stairs, She turned right and headed in a direction she hoped would be safer. But that path ended in a dead end with just one large window. "Just stop struggling now," Ethan said as he approached her. "You're making my job harder." Kaylee didn't reply, continuing to fight him with every ounce of strength she had. "We both know you won't get anywhere if you keep this up." She tried desperately to scream at him, but he clamped his hand over her mouth, silencing her. He grabbed her by the arms and dragged her toward him, forcing her to stand in front of him. She pushed him back, causing her foot to lose its balance. She reached for something to save herself but stumbled and fell through the window, plummeting from the 100th floor. As she fell, she cast a final glance at Ethan. His eyes were fixed upon her demise. Who was standing behind him? She wanted to know who had pushed her, as she clearly felt someone's hand on her shoulder while falling, but she lacked the breath to seek an answer to that question. All she could see was the blonde hair, as if someone were standing behind Ethan, but the darkness concealed their identity. As her body collided onto the unforgiving ground, the wind was knocked out of her and her eyes widened with shock as the ground rushed up to meet her, knocking the air out of her lungs. Just before landing, her head landed on the concrete, leaving a small cut on the back of her head just above the neck. It stung painfully and sent shooting pains throughout her entire body, but after some time she felt nothing. The world began to grow dark, and then it stopped completely. Few hours after murder, Ethan left his penthouse for a walk, lost in thought while smoking a cigarette when he heard his phone ring. He took it out of his pocket and saw a number displayed on the screen. "Why is my mom calling me now?" He frowned as he answered the call. "Has the meeting been postponed?" Miss Charlotte asked. "Yes, they will be here next week," Ethan replied, brushing his hair back from his forehead. He lied, knowing that the truth would only lead him to more trouble. "Why next week?" Miss Charlotte's voice was frustrated. "Do you not remember what we discussed yesterday?" She sounded slightly frantic. "There are some reasons. I'll explain in detail tomorrow." "What the heck?" Ethan exclaimed in frustration as a man pushed him forward. "I'll talk to you later about this." "I'm busy at the moment," he quickly ended the call, keeping his eyes fixed on the person who had pushed him. "Hey, someone has fallen from above." "Yes, I heard something breaking, like someone fell from a high floor." "Has anyone died?" "It looks like a girl." "This seems to be a police case." "Is this a crime scene?" Gradually, people began to gather around Kaylee's lifeless body, engaging in hushed conversations and expressing their condolences for the deceased. Despite her passing, her eyes remained wide open, as if she had witnessed something peculiar before her demise and forgotten to close them. Her face bore a frozen expression of horror, with the skin around her mouth and under her chin appearing rigid, as if reluctant to detach from the bones. Her long black hair cascaded onto her forehead, prompting speculation about how she could have fallen and sustained such a severe head injury. Some speculated that she may have been thrown from a great height by a vengeful murderer, while others pondered the unfortunate circumstances that likely left her without a chance to seek help. Blood trickled from the side of her head, making its way to the back of her skull like water down a drain. Carefully, someone stepped over the bloodstain, feeling the thick, warm syrup-like sensation under their shoes. One hand rested on the floor while the other tightly gripped a shattered glass. Her right leg bent at an unnatural angle, with her foot slightly hovering above the ground. As news of Kaylee's death rapidly spread, the hotel staff promptly contacted the authorities. Frustrated, Ethan distanced himself from the crowd and made his way back to his penthouse. Standing there any longer made him nauseous. He couldn't handle the sight of blood. He felt disgusted by Kaylee's lifeless body. Upon entering his room, his gaze immediately fell upon Ava, who was seated on his bed. He was taken aback to see her there. "When did you return from Australia?" Ethan forced a smile and asked. "Well, you see," she began, attempting to sound sincere. "I have a layover in Washington, so as soon as I landed, I hurried straight here to meet you." Ethan remained silent for a moment, unable to help but notice how stunning she looked. Her black curls framed her pale face, and her amber eyes stared intently at him. She wore the most beautiful smile he'd ever seen. She narrowed her eyes, observing him closely. "Are you all right?" she asked. "Yeah, I'm okay. It's just a business issue. You know, you were saying you came here for the first time. Do you want to explore the city?" He took a deep breath to collect his thoughts. "No, I don't want to explore the city. In fact, I wanted it to be a surprise," she responded, her intense gaze unwavering. "I thought it would be a romantic gesture to bring something special back for you. But I couldn't bear to wait any longer to see you, so I decided to come straight here instead." He just nodded, trying to walk away from her, but she hugged him from behind. "Why are you so quiet today?" she whispered, deliberately pressing her firm body against his back. She knew he wouldn't be able to resist. He never could. "I have a lot weighing on my mind." He exhaled slowly and wearily. "Then let me ease you," she smiled, positioning herself directly in front of him. "May I have your permission?" She always had a way of keeping him on his toes, knowing exactly how to make him do what she wanted. Charlotte was sitting in her luxurious mansion, in a room with a large view of the city below and the sea beyond. A glass of fine champagne in her hand, and a letter from the Delish Delight Company's presidents, Mr. Corleone and Mr. Moretti, sitting atop a table beside the box of cake. She took another sip and then opened the letter. Her eyes roamed over the letter, taking in every word, as if she could somehow absorb it into her body. Suddenly she threw the champagne glass across the room, where it shattered on the floor. The shards of glass reflected light that fell through the walls onto Charlotte's face, making it look even paler than it already was. She read the letter faster this time. The words raced across the page but didn't get lost. Charlotte didn't need to read them more than once before they were embedded deep into her brain, forming an image that would last for weeks on end, even years. The letters continued to buzz through her mind like a swarm of angry insects, each word a painful sting that only fueled her rage. Charlotte clenched her fists, the paper crumpling beneath her grip as if it could absorb some of her fury. The threat looming over her business felt all-consuming, a dark cloud that would not dissipate. "How dare they?" she gritted her teeth, a fierce determination igniting within her. She glanced at the box of cake and threw into the wall, creating a satisfying thud as it bounced off. "They're going to regret doing that. I'm gonna destroy their whole company," Charlotte yelled. Her voice rang through the air in a shrill crescendo. Even the servants standing outside of the door heard her voice. She took deep breaths before calling them inside. "Clean this mess," she ordered them, and took a last glance at the cake as their words repeated again in her mind like a curse. "And consider this cake a token of sympathy. I hope you still have your sweet tooth." With her arms crossed tightly across her chest, she stood there with a steely expression on her face. The servants hurriedly obeyed her commands and began to clean the mess on the ground with a broom and dustpan. Charlotte took another glass of champagne and drank it in one gulp. The maids followed suit as their hands held the dustpan filled with broken glass. They tried to clean the mess as fast as possible, but soon found themselves covered with blood and scratches from sharp pieces of glass still sticking into their skin. "Get it cleaned up now," Charlotte commanded them furiously as her eyes glowed like red flames. "And don't throw that cake," she commanded as another maid tried to pick it up. On Charlotte's command, she left it as it is and glanced at her. "My friends sent it, showing their affection, so I have to accept it wholeheartedly," she smiled. "Don't throw it, but save it." Charlotte's eyes twitched when she said that. Her words dripped with a veneer of sweetness, but beneath lay a storm of fury. Then her smile vanished, but there was something strange inside those eyes. They looked different than usual, but no one noticed. No one besides Charlotte. The servants hastily moved the broken pieces of glass on the ground and wiped the cake with a dry towel and put it back inside its cardboard box. Then they left her room immediately afterwards. They knew that when their lady boss was angry, it was best not to stay near her for too long. Charlotte sighed deeply as she watched the maids run away. She sat down again and sipped on her champagne, feeling numb all over. She was never fond of drinking alcohol, but after her encounter with the presidents of Delish Delight Company, she found herself craving to have some. It seemed that her soul ached, but her body didn't seem to be able to process the liquid, which was what caused this horrible reaction of hers. Ever since her company fell into this crisis, they have become threats to her business. They are the ones who complain to the authorities and damage the reputation of her company. She knows that they are the one after the food poisoning case, but she doesn't have any evidence yet. She even tried to settle this thing with them outside the court, but they demanded 60% of her Lopez Food Company, which she never let happen. Today they crossed all their limits. They sent her the legal notice of transforming the property along with the cake of their company. Charlotte felt the urge to laugh out loud. This is what they think, that her Lopez Food Company is an easy target for them to destroy. She chuckled as she took the last sip of her champagne. With red eyes burning with fury, she slammed the empty glass onto the table. She stared at the letter on the table. In a low, menacing tone, she muttered, "They should die. That's the least they deserve, right?" Charlotte extended her finger toward the letter but paused, a chill running down her spine. After a moment's hesitation, she grasped it firmly and ripped it into pieces. Soon the whole room was littered with countless crumpled-up pieces of paper, and some were still floating in the air. Then she got up and headed towards the bathroom to splash her face with cold water, which cooled down her anger slightly. Suddenly, Ethan's eyes snapped open as the alarm clock blared. He noticed that Ava was still fast asleep, so he reached over to the side table and turned off the alarm. Glancing at the clock, he saw that it was still 3 a.m. He picked up his pants from the floor and put them on before getting out of bed. He lit another cigarette and made his way out of the penthouse to smoke. The police lurked around, and Kaylee's lifeless body had been taken to the hospital for investigation. Detective Dario, the one he despised the most, was also present. Dario looked around the penthouse, trying to find any clue that could lead him to the investigation. Ethan sat on the bench and enjoyed his cigarette, making different shapes of smoke in the air. His eyes were half open, but he still looked focused on the road in front of him. Memories from the night before rushed back to him. He stared at Dario, a soft smile never leaving his lips. The detective was very tall, with short brown hair and a light beard that made him look old. When he saw Ethan, he walked toward him. "You're pretty calm about this situation," Detective Dario stated while leaning against the railing next to Ethan, "for a guy who killed a girl. How can you be so calm?" "Because I've experienced a lot worse than this before," Ethan responded. "What kind of experiences?" Detective Dario raised his eyebrow. "As if you don't know." Ethan stared deeply into his eyes and threw his cigarette on the road. "We both know you lied," Detective Dario said with no emotion whatsoever. "If you want to listen, then arrest me again. I just like to tell stories in the confession room." Ethan stubbed out a cigarette with his foot and walked away. "With pleasure, Mr. Lopez." Detective Dario shook his head with a sigh. There wasn't much he could do about Ethan. He always had to be suspicious of his motives. He knew that Ethan was an intelligent and powerful man, and Dario was sure he committed the murder. But like before, he never left any evidence. Dario was confident of Ethan's guilt, but he couldn't prove it yet. All he could do was watch him. As time passed, the hotel buzzed with activity. The once lavish hotel had transformed into a solemn place, haunted by the memory of Kaylee's lifeless body. 5 a.m. morning. It was 5 o'clock in the morning when Blair and Masson hurriedly made their way to the Luxor Lodgings Hotel, where they were supposed to arrive at 10:30 p.m. Exhausted from their long and difficult journey, they stumbled through the hotel entrance, drained of energy. The darkness of the early morning surrounded them as they quickly headed towards the entrance, desperately seeking relief from their weariness. He hides his short curly black hair under a hoodie, and his warm brown eyes look curiously around people. Walking was becoming challenging for them, as they were wearing designer clothes for the first time today. Neither of them could afford such expensive clothing, but Masson was unsure where Blair had obtained so much money. When he asked her about it, she changed the topic and he didn't press further. Even if it was just for one day, he felt a sense of wealth. With anticipation and apprehension, They cautiously entered the hotel. Their hearts pounded as they were met with an unsettling silence, contrasting the usual bustling atmosphere. The surroundings were illuminated by the flashing lights of police cars, casting an ominous glow on the scene before them. His detective sense was telling him that it's a crime scene. Police officers, dressed in black uniforms, patrolled the area while taking photos of crime scene evidence with large cameras attached to their belts. As soon as Mason saw his senior detective Dyro, he quickly hid his face. As they approached the fountain, the sight of the yellow caution tape sent a shiver down their spine. It was a stark reminder that something terrible had happened within these walls. The words, "Do not enter," seemed to mock them, warning of the horrifying scene that awaited their arrival. Two exhausted police officers stood guard, their faces showing a mix of fatigue and disbelief. Their eyes met Blair's, silently conveying the seriousness of the situation. It was evident that they were not prepared for what lay beyond that forbidden boundary. They prohibited them from coming here. Mason quickly turned to Blair as he caught Dyro's eyes. Taking a deep breath, he gathered the courage to speak. "What could possibly happen here, Blair?" he asked, not sure what to say. His voice was barely audible. Blair mirrored his shock and confusion. Her usually composed demeanor faltered as she searched the area for answers that were yet to be discovered. "Looks like we're too late," Blair responded, a tinge of regret in her voice. "The meeting must have already ended." Blair's response really caught him off guard. He was quite surprised to see Blair tilting her head back and gazing up at the towering height of the hotel. "There has been a murder here, Blair," he tried to remind her. She first looked at him and then at the police officers standing in front of them. "But we didn't come here for this murder case. The police will take care of it. We're actually late because Thomas Martin must be gone by now." Her words reminded him of their mission for being here. They walked into the hotel's spacious hall, trying to hide their identities by keeping their heads held high. All the staff at the reception were watching them. Blair took out a golden card with a capital O written on it from her designer bag. "Opulent Height's Penthouse Mastercard." Mason looked at her in surprise, leaning in to whisper in Blair's ear. She just smiled in response. Being a chef, she is well prepared, as if she is a professional spy or an undercover agent. They approached the sleek glass elevator at the end of the hall, its doors beckoning them to step inside. As they entered, the elevator operator greeted them with a polite nod and pressed the button for the Opulent Heights penthouse on the 100th floor. The doors closed, enclosing them in a small, mirrored space. As the elevator began its ascent, Mason couldn't help but feel a mix of excitement and nervousness. Reaching the penthouse was no ordinary feat. The elevator glided smoothly upwards, the soft music playing in the background adding to the air of mystery. He felt as if he were about to be granted entry to one of the most secure locations in Washington. The man who owned it, Dylan Gabriel, was an influential figure, and a billionaire. He knew of Dylan's many philanthropic efforts to help poor people and others of every kind. He is a self-made person who owns many businesses, including Gabriel Foundation, where he provides free education, health checkup and food for the homeless. Being his friend Ethan had a meeting at his place today, as Dylan stays in New York. Blair and Mason exchanged a knowing glance, silently reminding each other of the importance of their task. Blair had been sent here to retrieve a valuable piece of information that could potentially change the course of history, and Mason had only come to help his fiancée. He knows it's not that important, but since Blair asked him for help, he's doing it only for his love. As the elevator doors opened on the 100th floor, they stepped out and their eyes immediately locked onto the sleek black door of the penthouse. Blair confidently inserted the golden card into the electronic lock, as if this is her usual place to visit. With a soft click, the door swung open, revealing a truly breathtaking sight. They entered the penthouse and cautiously began exploring. To their surprise, there was no sign of anyone except for a girl peacefully sleeping in Ethan's master bedroom. Blair and Mason exchanged glances, realizing that not only was Thomas Martin absent, but Ethan himself was not there. They definitely come late. Not only Thomas Martin, but Ethan too, Mason muttered, looking at Blair. We're really late. Thieves often leave their mark as they go, Mason, Blair replied cryptically. Stop repeating my words, Miss Detective B, Mason chuckled. By the way, why did you come when you knew we were late? Blair rolled her eyes when he called her B. It's not like she doesn't like it. She just likes anyone to call her B except one person. Because Ethan is still inside, she said confidently and looked into his eyes. And how are you so sure about this? Mason raised his eyebrow. I know something that you don't, she smiled and winked at him.